Before we begin, if you've ever seen land split a family, tell me in the comments what it took first: money, pride, or silence. Earl Whitaker used to say a dry year could humble a man, but a note he did not understand could bury him. The morning the certified letter came, he laid it beside his open Bible on the kitchen table and did not touch his coffee. Outside, a North Nebraska wind pushed dust against the porch steps and rattled the loose tin on the machine shed. Inside, his youngest son Micah read the letter once, leaned back in his chair, and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the kind a grown son gives when he thinks his father has finally started fearing shadows. "They are not taking this land," Micah said. "Banks send letters. That's what they do." Earl looked at the red stamp, the maturity date, and the line about secured real estate, and he said, "No, son. This time they're coming for it." 6 weeks later, a yellow auction bill with a Whitaker name on it was pinned above the coffee machine at Miller Feed and Seed in West Point. By then, the whole county knew what the family still would not say plainly inside their own house. The debt was real, the land was listed, and the sale would not just move machinery and acres. It would sell the last thing still pretending to hold the Whitakers together. So before we go any further, tell me this in the comments. When money comes for a family's land, what breaks first, the farm or the people? Because Earl had prayed over that note. His daughter had found something in the paperwork no one else had bothered to read. His oldest son wanted to cut the farm in half to save the home place. And the boy who laughed was about to learn that a bank does not care how long your last name has been painted on the barn. The Whitaker place sat west of West Point, Nebraska, where the road ran straight until it met a cedar windbreak and a mailbox with fading black numbers nobody had repainted in years. The home place was 160 acres, though nobody in that family ever said it that way. They said the house quarter, the barn quarter, the south pasture, the creek field. Land stops being acreage when a family has loved it long enough. It turns into chores, directions, and memory. Earl was 68 and built like a man who had spent more years lifting feed sacks than speaking his mind. His hands were broad, scarred, and always looked a little dusty, even after washing. He had inherited caution from his father and silence from his mother. And between those two things, he had survived enough hard seasons to mistrust any year that looked too easy. His wife, June, kept the kitchen like a place people could still come home to. She folded dish towels over the oven handle, kept apples in a ceramic bowl whether anyone ate them or not, and stacked unpaid bills in neat piles as if order itself might soften them. Her faith was quiet. A verse card in the sugar jar. A hand on a shoulder before anyone backed out of the drive. A whisper of, "Lord, help us," so small it sometimes sounded like breathing. Their oldest son Daniel was 42, broad through the shoulders like Earl, slower with words than with work, and steady in the way that can look like stubbornness until trouble comes. He believed in paying down principal, fixing what already sat in the shed, and knowing exactly how much diesel was left before dark. If Earl belonged to the old world, Daniel belonged to the last honest piece of it. Micah, the youngest, was 38 and bright in all the ways a struggling farm can mistake for salvation. He could talk to lenders without sounding small, knew how to run projections on a phone while driving a pickup, and carried himself like a man with no intention of farming the way his father had farmed. He loved the land too, but he loved the future version of it. The bigger version, the faster version, the one that would finally make the family stop worrying. Then there was Claire, 35, back home with her 9-year-old daughter Lucy after a hard divorce in Norfolk. Claire had returned, believing the farm was the one thing in her life that still meant what it used to mean. She handled books, meal runs, payroll entries, grain sheets, insurance forms, and all the invisible work that keeps a farm from becoming only dirt and iron. Lucy slept upstairs in a room that had once been Claire's, beneath a sloped ceiling and a row of horse ribbons faded from blue to gray. The operation itself was not huge by modern standards, but it was more than enough to stretch a family thin if they stopped telling the truth. 160 acres around the house. Another 160 a mile north. 2 rented quarters. Corn, soybeans, a modest cow-calf herd, 1 machine shed, 1 older grain setup, 1 combine that was always 1 repair away from becoming a prayer request, and 1 red barn that everybody knew was too old to save and too beloved to tear down. They attended St. Paul's on Sundays unless weather, calving, planting, breakdowns, or shame got in the way. Earl did not say much in fellowship hall, but people listened when he did. June sang under her breath. Daniel sat straight. Micah sometimes came in late with market prices still on his mind. Claire sang when she could get through it. That was the Whitaker life before the sale bill went up. Work first, words later. Love mostly assumed. Fear almost never spoken clearly. And like a lot of farm families, they mistook that silence for strength right up until the silence started working for the bank. The trouble did not begin with 1 bad crop or 1 cruel banker. That would have been easier to name and easier to hate. It began the way a lot of farm trouble begins, with a good year that made the next risk look reasonable. 2 strong harvests had given Micah confidence and given the bank appetite. A retiring neighbor offered them a rented quarter at terms too tempting to ignore. A machinery dealer had a late model planter he called a smart move. A seed rep said they were under-equipped for the acres they could be carrying. And Trent Lawson from Platte Valley AG Bank sat in a conference room in town and said the sentence that has led more than 1 farm family to the edge of ruin. The farms that last, he said, are the farms willing to scale. Micah believed him because he wanted to. Daniel doubted him because he had heard that kind of sentence before. Earl said almost nothing in the meeting except 1 line on the drive home. The farms that last, he said, staring through the windshield, are the farms that can sleep. Micah laughed. Dad, he said, you can't farm scared. At first the expansion did not feel like danger. It felt like motion. A newer planter meant they could cross ground faster. A larger operating line meant they could prepay inputs and chase discounts. 1 machinery note got rolled into another. Terms got stretched. Crop insurance projections got tied to expected yields. Everyone told themselves it was temporary, and farming is always temporary right up until the paperwork becomes permanent. Then the easy part ended. An August dry spell cut the corn harder than Micah had projected. Fertilizer rose. Diesel rose. Repair bills came in clusters, as if machines talk to one another and agree when to fail. The rented ground did not produce the way the salesman said it would. Basis weakened. Interest reset higher than expected. And from then on, every decision the family made began with the same poisoned hope. Maybe harvest fixes it. Harvest did not fix it. It narrowed the hole once, then opened it wider. Claire noticed the mood change first because she was the one opening envelopes nobody else wanted to touch. She saw which statements got folded twice, which vendor invoices disappeared under seed brochures, which receipts Micah stopped handing over right away. She noticed Daniel staying longer in the machine shed at night with both hands on his hips. She noticed June wiping the same patch of counter after everyone had gone to bed. She noticed Earl reading the back pages of bank notes the way some men read obituaries. At supper, the conversations got shorter. How much is due Friday? We'll cover it. Did you talk to the bank? They're working with us. What does that mean? It means let harvest happen. That phrase, let harvest happen, started showing up everywhere. It became permission to postpone clarity. It became a family religion more dangerous than disbelief. Daniel wanted to cut back. Sell extra cattle. Exit 1 rented quarter. Freeze machinery spending. Reduce exposure while they still could. He said it plainly more than once, and each time Micah answered with the kind of confidence only a desperate man can call wisdom. If we shrink now, Micah said, we'll never climb back. Earl did not argue much. He only kept asking the same question in different forms. What is actually tied to the note? Micah would say, the operating L, INE. Daniel would say, and machinery. Claire would say, and whatever else is cross-secured. Micah hated that phrase. Cross-secured. It sounded like the sort of language people use when they want ordinary paperwork to feel sinister. Trent Lawson had called it standard language. Standard renewal. Standard collateral. Standard structure. A family can get killed by the word standard if they hear it enough. The fall they should have been honest with one another. They got busier instead. The corn came off wetter than they wanted. Drying cost more. A grain bin fan failed. The combine needed the repair Daniel had predicted all year. Lucy heard more cupboard doors closing than laughter. June began turning the radio on low during supper, not for music, but to spare them from the sound of what nobody was saying. Then came the bang packet Claire almost missed. It was thick, clipped, and full of dense pages too easy to fake understanding by skimming. She took it to the kitchen after Lucy went to bed, sat beneath the hanging light, and started reading with a yellow marker in hand. 2 pages in, she stopped, then went back, then stopped again. At the top of one page, under collateral description, the own ground was listed. Not just the North Quarter, not just crop assignments. The home place, too. The house quarter. The original 160. The land Earl had always said would never again be used to hold up a bad year. Claire read it 3 times before standing. The next morning, Earl found her already at the table, eyes red, packet. Open. Dad, she said, tapping the L. I-N-E. I think the bank already has the house grow. U-N-D. That was the moment the trouble finally took shape. And it was also the moment Micah still said not to pee. Anik. Earl took the packet to the machine shed instead of the kitchen because there are things a man can read under tin and not survive reading under his children's eyes. The shed smelled like grease, old hay dust, cold steel, and spilled diesel. He sat on an upside-down bucket beside a tire taller than Lucy, laid the papers over his knee, and stared at the clause Claire had marked until the words stopped swimming and started condemning. Secured by all previously pledged real estate. That was it. Not dramatic, not underlined, not even new in the legal sense, but devastating in the living sense. He remembered Trent saying they were just cleaning things up. He remembered nodding because there had been too many pages and because men raised the way Earl was raised would rather look ignorant before a lawyer than afraid before their sons. He remembered signing where Micah pointed. He remembered believing standard language meant harmless language. There in the shed, with the wind ticking loose tin overhead, Earl took off his cap and bowed his head. He did not pray for a miracle. Men like Earl usually stop praying for miracles before they stop believing in God. He prayed the way tired people pray. Lord, he said softly, if I was proud, show it to me. If I was foolish, let me own it. And if this land is leaving us, do not let it take the children with it. When he stood again, the note was still the note. The ink had not moved. The bank had not softened. But the prayer did one thing. It made him willing to say aloud what the rest of the family was still trying not to name. The meeting at Platte Valley AG Bank happened on a gray Thursday morning that looked like it had been made from old feed sacks. Trent Lawson met them in a small office with framed aerial photos of healthy fields on the wall, the kind of pictures banks like because they never show breakdowns, arguments, or overdue bills. Earl came in first, Daniel behind him, Micah carrying a folder and too much confidence, Claire with a notepad, June because this time she insisted on hearing every word herself. Trent was not a movie villain. That matters. He was a careful man in a pressed shirt who had learned how to deliver bad news without ever sounding like the one holding the knife. He offered coffee. Nobody took any. He began where bank men begin when the answer has already been decided. We reviewed year-end position, projected cash flow, current debt service, and collateral exposure. Daniel waited as if plain English might still arrive if he stayed patient. Claire finally said, just tell us what you need. Trent folded his hands. To renew the operating line under current conditions, the bank requires a principal curtailment of $175,000 before March 1st. Silence. In addition to that, he continued, we would need a reduction in machinery exposure and a plan to improve projected working capital. How much are we carrying total? Earl asked. Trent looked at the paper. With operating, machinery, cattle note, and accrued interest, just over $1.1 million. June shut her eyes. Micah leaned forward. That's why we need to stay whole. If we start liquidating productive assets, we kill earnings. Daniel turned to him. If we stay whole, we lose the ground. Trent cleared his throat. There is also the collateral issue. Claire already knew, but she made him say it. The home place, she said. Is it tied? Trent answered in the flat language institutions use when they want to sound factual instead of responsible. The current note is cross-collateralized with previously pledged real estate, including the residence tract and original 160. June looked at Earl. Earl did not look back. Micah said, you told us this was standard renewal language. It is standard, Trent said, but standard does not mean without effect. That sentence sat in the room like a nail. Earl's voice, when it came, was quiet. Did I ask you more than once whether the house ground was protected? Trent inhaled. You asked whether liquidation was likely. At the time, renewal remained possible. That is not what I asked, Earl said. Micah jumped in too fast. Dad, this isn't helping. No, Earl said, still quiet. It would have helped before. For the first time that morning, Micah lost his smoothness. We're not the only family carrying paper. Corn turns one direction, and everybody acts like we're dead already. Daniel looked at him with a face so tired it bordered on contempt. This isn't about corn turning one direction, he said. It's about us borrowing like next year was promised. Claire asked the last question worth asking. If we don't bring the curtailment? Trent's eyes dropped to the table. Then we move to liquidation. June pressed a hand to her throat. What kind of liquidation? He hesitated, then chose professionalism over mercy. Voluntary sale is always preferable. If not, the bank would proceed with secured asset disposition, including equipment and real estate as necessary. There it was. Real estate as necessary. Micah still tried once more. If we put another crop in, if we get through spring. Trent cut in, not cruelly, but finally. Micah, the bank is no longer in a position to lend on hope. That was when the room changed. Not because they had learned something completely new, because what had been circling the family for months had finally said its name. Out in the parking lot, nobody spoke for a full minute. Wind pushed a plastic bag along the curb. A truck rattled by on the highway. Somewhere in town, a church bell hit the hour. Then Earl said, I told you. Micah answered no. You wanted to be right. And from that moment on, the Whitakers stopped having one problem. They had two. The bank and each other. That night the kitchen became a courtroom. Not in a loud movie way. It was worse. Rural families usually know how to stay seated while they tear each other apart. Claire spread the renewal packet on the table and marked the clauses she had found. Daniel stood at the counter with both palms flat on the laminate, reading over her shoulder. June kept saying, please, one at a time, which is what mothers say when they already know one at a time will still be fatal. Micah defended the expansion the way people defend mistakes when too much of their identity is buried under them. We had to grow, he said. Everybody said the same thing. Daniel snapped back. Everybody isn't sitting in this kitchen. If we had two better crops, but we didn't. If diesel hadn't jumped, but it did. If Dad hadn't frozen every time a decision had to be made. Earl turned. Watch yourself. Micah did for maybe 3 seconds. No, he said. I'm done pretending this is all me. We've been half in and half out for years. We borrow like a big farm and think like a small one. We want scale money with church basement caution. June flinched. Daniel pushed away from the counter. You want the truth? Fine. You wanted to look bigger than we were. Bigger planter. Newer iron. More acres. Always one more season away from proving you were the one who saw it before the rest of us. Micah laughed once, bitter now. And you wanted to die with the same machinery Dad bought when Clinton was president. Claire finally cut through them. This isn't even the full problem. That stopped the room. She lifted another page. The home place stayed tied because an older deed of trust was never properly released when they rolled the prior line. It kept carrying forward. Every renewal dragged it with it. June asked, "What does that mean?" Claire looked at her mother, then at Earl. "It means the land Dad kept saying was safe was never really safe." No one spoke. Earl's face changed first, not into anger, into the kind of shame that makes a person look suddenly older than the room remembers. Daniel understood it before Micah did. "You knew there was old paper on that ground," Daniel said. Earl swallowed. "I knew there used to be." "Did you ever confirm it was off?" Earl did not answer at once. June answered for him with the gentleness of somebody betraying the man she loves, because truth has finally become less cruel than silence. "He asked once," she said. "Maybe twice." Daniel stared at his father as if he had never seen him clearly before. "You asked once." Earl's voice came low. "I thought I understood what I signed." Micah grabbed that opening like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. "So now it's my fault because Dad didn't read legal paper?" Claire slammed the highlighter down. "No, Micah. It's everyone's fault because nobody slowed down long enough to tell the truth." Upstairs, Lucy started crying. Claire went to her, sat on the bed, rubbed her back, and told her everything was all right in the tone adults use when they know it is not. When she came back down, the fight had gone colder. Daniel wanted immediate reduction. Sell cows. Exit the north rented quarter. List machinery before the bank forced them to. Try to preserve the house quarter and maybe the north 160 if the numbers held. Micah said selling early would only prove weakness and ruin any negotiating position. Negotiating position? Daniel said. "You still think we're negotiating?" June sank into a chair. "What happens to the house?" Nobody answered. Claire did not mean to say the next part out loud, but once some truths start moving, they stop asking permission. "What happens to Lucy?" she said. "What am I supposed to tell my daughter? That the one place I brought her, because it was safe, was actually collateral?" June began to cry then. Not dramatically, just steadily. Earl stood at the window and did not turn around. The next weeks widened every old crack in the family. Micah stayed out later, making calls from the pickup, talking to input men, lenders, a machinery dealer, anybody who might still help him believe another move existed. Daniel got harsher, not louder, and there is almost nothing more dangerous in a family than a quiet man who no longer thinks gentleness is helping. Claire became the keeper of paper and therefore the unwilling keeper of truth. June tried to keep everybody at one table as if casserole could still do the work of reconciliation. Thanksgiving came and felt like a rehearsal dinner for grief. Micah said grace because June asked him to. Halfway through it, his voice broke. "Lord," he said, "show us a way." Earl looked at his plate. Daniel did not bow his head at all. After the meal, while the dishes sat in cloudy water, Daniel found Micah in the mudroom and said the sentence that would live between them longer than the auction. "If they sell this place," he said, "they won't be the ones who broke it." Micah stared at him. "You think I don't love this farm?" "I think you loved what it could make you feel like." It was a cruel thing to say. It was also close enough to the truth that neither brother ever fully came back from it. Once the fighting finally exhausted itself, the Whitakers began doing what families do when denial can no longer pay interest. They started selling pieces of the life they had built and calling it a plan. The first to go were 28 bred cows. Earl loaded them himself before daylight. Each gate clanged, sounding like punctuation at the end of a sentence he had not wanted to write. The trailer left tracks through frozen mud all the way to the county road. June stood at the sink without her coat on and watched. Daniel sold a welding rig he had paid for with side work over 10 years. Claire cashed out the small savings she had been trying to rebuild after the divorce. Micah listed a pickup he loved more than he should have. It still was not enough. One Sunday after church, Pastor Ben asked Earl if he would stay a minute. They stood alone in the fellowship hall under fluorescent lights that made everybody look tired. "You don't have to carry this as one man," the pastor said. Earl looked at the coffee urns, the folding chairs, the bulletin board of missionary postcards. "No," he said, "but I might have to answer for it as one." That week, Claire got them in front of a farm attorney in Norfolk. The man listened, read the note, asked good questions, and then leaned back with the face doctors and lawyers were when they were about to tell the truth too late. "If you come in 6 months earlier," he said, "I might have had room to move. Chapter 12, maybe. Structured liquidation, maybe. With sale notice this close and cash flow where it is, your leverage is thin. Can we save the house ground?" June asked. The attorney took off his glasses. "Not without cash the bank believes in." On the drive home, nobody said much. Fields passed by in winter brown. Corn stubble. Gray sky. Lucy slept in the back with her head against the window. Claire watched frost tracing the corners of the glass. Earl kept both hands on the wheel. That night, for the first time in months, he called all 3 children to the table and did not wait for somebody else to begin. "I need to say this plain," he said. They looked at him. "I kept calling this weather because I could bear weather. I cannot bear pride. I thought if I did not sound afraid, I was leading. I thought if I signed enough paper and worked enough hours, I could outlast a bad decision. I was wrong. Nobody moved. I should have slowed us down. I should have made somebody explain every line. I should have listened harder when Daniel said cut back. I should have asked better when Micah said we needed room. And I should not have let your mother think silence was peace." June covered her mouth. Micah looked away. Daniel stared at the table grain. Claire cried quietly, not because the speech fixed anything, but because it was the first honest sound the house had made in a long time. Then Earl said something harder. "If the land goes, I do not want the family buried with it." That was the nearest they came to reconciliation before the sale. Daniel agreed to help sort titles and machinery records. Claire organized paperwork for the auction company. June boxed dishes and marked the bottoms in case the house sold faster than anyone expected. Micah kept working the phones, still chasing a rescue no one else believed in. A church couple brought meals twice. A neighbor offered storage for family keepsakes. Small kindnesses began appearing around the edges, which is often what happens when a community can no longer pretend it doesn't see. But the bank did not change course. Because institutions rarely reverse themselves simply because a family has finally become honest. When a sale bill proof arrived for approval, it listed tractors, tools, livestock, grain inventory, the North 160, and the home place. Earl looked at his own address and auction print and said very softly, "There it is." Micah still said, "It doesn't mean it's gone." Earl answered, "No, it means it's leaving." Auction morning came cold and bright, the kind of late winter Nebraska morning that makes every metal surface sting and every breath show itself. Pickups lined the county road by 8 o'clock. Men stood in small clusters with styrofoam cups and gloved hands. Women stayed near the vehicles at first, then moved closer when it became clear this was not going to be one of those quiet farm sales where everybody pretends not to notice the human part. The yellow bill flapped against the registration table. Whitaker Farms. Earl had seen his name on checks, mailboxes, tax forms, and seed orders for decades. He had never hated the sight of it until it became inventory. Claire took Lucy to June's cousin's car before the bidding began. The child had already asked too many clear questions. "Are they buying my room? Who gets the swing? If we leave the dog dish, does that mean we're coming back?" Claire had answered none of them. WL. Daniel spent the first hour by the machinery row, hands in his coat pockets, jaws set hard enough to hurt a tooth. Micah moved constantly, from the clerk table to Trent Lawson, from Trent to his pickup, from the pickup back to the ring. Phone at his ear. Head down. Hope turning franny. See, the personal property started first. Socket sets, chains, fence stretchers, feed bunks, An old rake nobody had used in years, but nobody had wanted gone. Then bigger things. The grain truck, the baler, the cattle trailer. A tractor Earl had once believed would outlast him. There is a particular humiliation in hearing the objects of your working life reduced to chant rhythm. Do I hear 5, now 10, now 12 and a half, looking for 15? Tools you bought in need becoming numbers shouted by a man in clean glove. Daniel watched the cattle trailer leave and rubbed a hand over his face. June sat in Claire's SUV and twisted a handkerchief until it looked like rope. Earl stood farther back than anyone expected, near the windbreak, hat low, as if distance might make the event less personal. It did no. By mid-morning the machinery was mostly through, and the mood changed the way a crowd always changes when the scenes shift from iron to dirt. People got quieter. Boots moved less. Even the auctioneer slowed his speech. Because machines are one thing. Ground is Anoa. The North 160 came first. Good soil. Decent drainage. A field Daniel knew well enough to spot every clay seam after rain. Bidding opened strong. A local operator started it. Another joined in. Then an investor's representative, dark coat, clipboard. No history in his FAC. Micah stepped forward. Daniel turned. What are you doing? Buying it back if I can. With what? Micah did not answer because the chant was already moving. He had a letter in his pocket from a hard money lender out of Sioux City. Not a rescue. More like expensive oxygen. Enough, maybe, to let him bid. Enough to let him believe public failure would still feel better than standing there empty-handed. He jumped the next number. Heads turn. Daniel walked toward him. Stop. Micah kept his eyes on the ring. Another bid. Then his. Then another. Price climbing. Too fast. Too proud. Trent Lawson saw what was happening before Earl did. He stepped toward the clerk and said something low. The clerk nodded. Micah reached the top of what the letter could support. The investor's man went one increment above it. The auctioneer looked up. Need the next one. Micah said nothing. Fair warning. Still nothing. Sold. The North 160 was gone. Daniel looked at his brother with something worse than anger. Pity mixed with contempt. You just ran the price on ground you couldn't carry, he said. For what? Micah spun toward him. For trying. Daniel answered low enough that only the near circle heard. No. For performing. That word landed like a slap. June got out of the SUV against Claire's protests because mothers cannot always remain seated while their children destroy each other in public. Please, she said. Please not here. But of course it was here. It had always been heading here. Then came the home place. The auctioneer described the house. The machine shed. The grain setup. The barn, as is. The original 160. Earl closed his eyes when he heard original tract. Not because he thought the crowd cared, but because he did. For 1 second nobody bid. That second was the worst part of the day. Not the shouting. Not the sale. That 1 second. Because in it the place where his children had slept, where June had canned peaches, where Claire had returned broken, where Lucy had relearned safety, hung in the air like an orphaned thing. Then the bidding began. Not wild. Controlled. Serious. Men who had the money. Men who wanted the dirt, not the memories. A local operator. The investor group again. One retired farmer once, then not again, maybe out of conscience, maybe because conscience is rarely liquid. Micah looked at Danny. Help me. Daniel stared at him. With what? Stand in with me. If we split it. With what money, Micah? We'll work it out. Daniel laughed then, and it was the hardest sound anybody in the family had ever heard from him. That, he said, is the sentence that sold this farm. Earl heard He turned, finally, and walked toward them. Enough, he said. Neither son spoke. Earl took Micah's bidder card slowly from his hand and gave it to Claire. Then he looked at both boys. This place is not leaving because the bank was stronger, he said. It's leaving because we stopped being one house before they ever printed the bill. The bidding climbed again. Claire did not watch the final increments. She was looking at June, whose face had gone pale in that terrible way grief can imitate illness. From the cousin's car window, Lucy had her palm pressed to the glass, not understanding the numbers, but understanding the adults. When the hammer fell, the home place went to the investor group. A neat man in a dark coat signed papers on the hood of a pickup less than 20 yards from the porch where June had once lined wet boots after snow. Micah walked away first, past the seed tender, past the cattle panels, all the way to the road. Daniel did not follow. He simply stood with both hands on his hips, staring at the dirt, looking like a man who had been proved right in the worst possible way and would never enjoy it. Earl removed his cap. No speech came. No last stand. No miracle buyer from church. Just a cold wind through the cedars and a farm changing owners while the family who had built it failed, in the end, to stay near each other long enough to grieve it together. By 3 that afternoon, the crowd was thinning. Purchased equipment was being tagged. Men who had whispered all morning began talking normally again. The auctioneer thanked everyone for coming, as if this had been a community event and not an amputation. Claire found June in the kitchen one last time before they locked up. Her mother was standing at the sink, looking out into the yard. "I thought," June said, "if we loved it right, it would stay." Claire did not answer. There are no useful sentences for a mother saying that in the house she is about to lose. On the counter sat Earl's Bible, the certified letter still folded inside it where he had placed it weeks earlier. He picked it up, tucked it under his arm, and left the key on the table. The Whitakers moved in pieces. June and Earl rented a small duplex on the edge of West Point with beige siding, a patch of grass too small to matter, and neighbors close enough to hear cabinet doors. Claire found a 2-bedroom apartment in Norfolk near Lucy's new school. Daniel took a full-time shop job with the co-op and rented a place 15 miles away because he could not bear driving past the sold ground before dawn every morning. Micah left for custom harvest work down south that spring and never said exactly when he would be back. If you want to know whether an auction can tear a family apart, the answer is yes. But not always in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it does it in missed birthdays. Sometimes in holidays that become maybe next year. Sometimes in a mother keeping 2 extra chairs at Thanksgiving out of habit long after she knows nobody is coming. June called both boys that first Easter. Daniel answered. Mike had texted back hours later. Claire brought Lucy in a store pie because she still could not bring herself to bake the way she used to in the farmhouse kitchen. Earl sat at the end of the duplex table with a paper napkin under his plate because June had not yet bought cloth ones for the new place. When they bowed to pray, he did not ask God to bring the farm back. He said, "Thank you for what still remains. Forgive what we broke before the bank ever touched it." Daniel's amen was barely audible. Micah was not there. By summer, the investor group had leased the home place to an operator from 2 counties over. He was not a bad man. That almost made it worse. He planted the fields clean, kept his machinery neat, and looked embarrassed the one time Earl saw him at the edge of the property and lifted a hand from the road. A bad man would have been easier to blame. That July, a storm peeled more tin from the old red barn. The investors decided it was a liability and had it pushed down before fall. Claire heard first from a neighbor. She drove out after work and parked on the shoulder with Lucy asleep in the back seat. The barn was already half gone. One wall stood crooked against the sky. Old beams lay split in the grass. The loft window where Claire had once hidden with library books and a flashlight was a broken square hanging over nothing. She called Earl from the road. He arrived 20 minutes later, and the old pickup Daniel had not yet had the heart to sell. He got out slowly, shut the door without sound, and stood beside her with both hands in his coat pockets. Neither of them crossed the fence. They just watched. After a long time, Claire said, "I didn't know whether to tell you." Earl kept his eyes on the barn. "There wasn't a way to tell it kindly," he said. The excavator moved again. Another section fell in on itself. Lucy woke in the back seat and asked, "Grandpa, are they tearing down our barn?" Earl closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "Yes, baby, they are." She was quiet. Then came the question Claire had been dreading since the sale. "Did God not hear you?" Earl turned and looked at the child through the open car window. His face did not harden. It did something sadder than that. It softened. "He heard me," Earl said. "Sometimes hearing us and sparing us are not the same thing." Lucy frowned, not satisfied, but too young to argue with sorrow. That fall June tried to gather everyone for Thanksgiving in the duplex. Daniel came early and fixed a sticking closet door before anyone asked. Claire brought sweet potatoes. Lucy made place cards on index paper. One said Uncle Micah and sat empty all afternoon. Micah called just before noon from Texas, where he was hauling grain carts for a custom crew. June held the phone too tightly. "Are you coming for Christmas?" He paused too low. I don't know yet." Daniel heard enough from across the room to stand and walk outside. When June hung up, she stared at the phone for a while before setting it due. "WN. He says he's busy," she said. No one answered because busy is often just a cleaner word for ashamed. That winter Earl started waking before dawn with nowhere to chore. Men who have measured life by gates, weather, and livestock rarely retire peacefully into carpet and drywall. He drank coffee by the duplex window and read from the same Bible that still held the old certified letter folded inside. Some mornings June would find him with one hand resting over it, not reading, just sitting there as if paper could still explain what pride had already finished. By February, Daniel had settled into a life he had never wanted. He worked inside more than outside. He had weekends he did not know what to do with. He visited his parents faithfully, fixed whatever was loose, took Earl to appointments, changed furnace filters, loaded groceries, then drove home before dark. He and Claire spoke often. He and Micah almost never did. Claire tried twice to bring the brothers into the same room. Once at Christmas, once at June's birthday in March. Both attempts failed for opposite reasons. Daniel said there was no use pretending. Micah said there was no use being judged. Between them lay not only the sold farm, but the unbearable fact that each man blamed himself just enough to need the other one to be guilty. The next planting season came, as seasons always do, indifferent to human arrangements. Rose went in on the Whitaker ground under someone else's management. Input trucks came and went. The mailbox got replaced. The porch light changed. One afternoon, Lucy saw a trampoline in the yard and said, "Another little girl lives there now." Claire gripped the steering wheel and said no thing. The final break came in small clothing. In late June, June asked if Micah would come help move the last of the box things out of the storage shed by the old place. The investors had given them one more week. He said he would Daniel came. Claire came. Micah did not. Inside the shed were the leftovers of a life too ordinary to auction well. Coffee, cans of bent nails. A Christmas nativity with one chipped shepherd. Lucy's old stick horse. Earl's father's hay hooks. A box of church bulletins June had saved because one of the children had once played piano on a given Sunday. They loaded in silence until Daniel found a dented seed sign Micah had hung in the machine shed during the expansion year. Bright colors, big promises, better yield, more upside. Daniel stared at it a long time, then set it face down in the truck bed. Earl, watching him, said, "Let it lie." Daniel's jaw worked. "He laughed at you," he said. "From the first note to the last bid, he laughed at you." Earl answered without anger. He laughed because he was afraid and did not know how to look small. That should have helped. Instead, it made Daniel look hurt. "And what about me?" he said. "What was I?" Earl took longer with that answer. "You were right too early," he said. "And after that, you made being right your only mercy." Daniel looked away. There are truths a son can hear from his father and recover from. That was not one of them. He finished loading the truck, shut the tailgate, and drove off before supper. That night, June sat on the duplex couch with one of Lucy's forgotten crayons in the scene beside her and said the sentence she had been resisting for over a year. "I don't think they're coming back to each other." Earl looked toward the dark window. "No," he said. "I don't think so either." On the first anniversary of the auction, Claire drove out alone before sunrise and parked at the edge of the county road. The house looked smaller than she remembered. The barn was gone. The cedar windbreak was still there. Frost sat on the field in a pale skin. For a moment it all looked almost beautiful, which offended her more than ugliness would have. Earl arrived a few minutes later. He got out, stood beside her, and kept his eyes on the ground. "Do you still pray for it?" Claire asked. "The land?" he said. She nodded. He thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I pray for the people who lost themselves on it." They stood there in the cold without talking. Then he said something she would remember long after the field itself changed hands again. "In the shed that morning, I asked the Lord not to let the land take the children with it." He paused. "I think I asked too late." Claire cried quietly, the way adults do when they already know no one is coming to rescue the meaning from what happened. The Whitaker farm never came back. The brothers never fully reconciled. June kept setting an extra place longer than she admitted. Lucy stopped calling the sold ground home by the next school year, which hurt Claire more than any legal paper ever had. And Earl kept the certified letter inside his Bible until the edges softened and the fold began to tear, as if even paper gets tired carrying the weight of a family's unfinished grief. Some losses do not end when the auctioneer goes silent. Sometimes they go on in smaller rooms, over cheaper tables, in quieter prayers. And sometimes faith does not save the farm. Sometimes faith is the only thing left sitting with you after the land is gone. The barn is down, and the family you beg God to spare has learned how to live apart. That was the Whitaker story. The land was gone. The house was gone. And the prayer Earl prayed in the machine shed was only half answered. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments what hurt most, the bank taking the land or the family breaking before the sale ever happened. And if you've ever watched pride, debt, inheritance, or silence do damage in a family, I'd like to hear where it started. This is The Bank and the Barn, where some stories end in survival, some in loss, and some in the kind of truth people carry the rest of their lives. If you want more American farm stories about debt, land, inheritance, faith, foreclosure, and the families caught in between, subscribe and stay with us.